So there's been some Twitter drama involving Margaret Hodge, Ash Sarkar, and a footage of Margaret Hodge, giving a speech previously. Now, of course, we've actually been talking about this before, about issues with regards to racial demographic change in this country. That's been a discussion beforehand about British attitudes towards immigration and how this has kind of changed over time. Now, there is a speech that's gone viral that was posted by Ash Sarkar of Margaret Hodge doing a speech around issues regarding immigration, which we're going to watch in a second. I think it's worth discussing the framing of what Ash Sarkar's been talking about here. So let's have a look. So Margaret Hodge talking about what that she would have felt fear living in Barking and Dagenham and seeing different faces in the schools, by which one can only presume she means black and brown kids. I'm sorry, what? Now let's listen to the clip in question.
You suddenly find your neighbours have changed, and if you suddenly find your neighbours have changed, and you suddenly find that the food in the shops is different, and you suddenly find that the faces in the schools are different, that creates fear. It does create, we all have a fear of change. And it's all too easy for the middle classes who don't undergo this sort of change in their environment to be critical of it. And I think very, very strongly, I think if I lived in Barking, I don't live in Barking, I work in Barking, Dagenham. If I'd lived there, I'd have felt that same fear of change. And if you suddenly find...
So there's a lot of caveats to this particular statement that I think have not really been demonstrated. Now, this idea that people just are necessarily scared of change, not really true. The idea that broadly British society are unaccepting of this kind of change, broadly, actually, the statistics show that that's not really the case. I mentioned it before on stream that when polled about people who feel that they would be happy to live next to an immigrant, or wouldn't be rather, like only 2% of polled said they wouldn't be happy living next to an immigrant. It's one of the lowest rates of that kind of sentiment in Europe entirely. So it's not really representative of people in general. The statement that she's made there, that she might feel this kind of fear of change or whatever it might be, pretty eye-opening for her to say that about, to make this assumption about how she would feel if she lived in this specific area, as to, what would happen if she saw, presumably, as Ash points out, more black and brown faces around. It sounds pretty sus. And Ash Sarkar continues, Margaret Hodge is a multimillionaire, and yet in this odd diatribe, she says it's only middle-class people who don't have a problem with rising ethnic diversity. It's racist ventriloquism, bigoted views in the mouths of an imaginary working-class person. I don't think that most people, whether they're working class or middle class, or those with millions of pounds stashed in tax havens, see kids from a diverse range of backgrounds whooping and careening around the playground and feel quote-unquote fear. And I think that's true, and as I said, the statistics that we have so far do show that, and it's actually far less of an issue now. Really and truly, it's not this idea that's being talked about in this particular clip with Margaret Hodge doesn't really gel with like a particular this kind of claim towards the human nature of this fear of change. I think that's not necessarily something that I've ever seen to be properly demonstrated. The statistics show that communities that have more immigration, where people will become even happier with the immigrants that are there as they live around them, for example, right? Where, the actual genuine fear of change come from places where those faces don't already exist. It's the areas with very low levels of immigration that fear becoming like the places that are, rather than the areas that have the immigration already, which is that's the real concern. The race, the kind of the fear that these people have, quote unquote, that is being referred to here. Which again, I think is a bit of a misconception. Because the real problem is that this was during an era, this speech I believe was from a few years ago, back when, in a kind of the Brexit era of the discussion, the media were the real issue. The media were the ones parroting the racism, trying to make it into the big political issue, trying to rile up the public back when it was clearly at the top of people's priorities with regards to political policy, when it really is nowhere near that right now. Nowhere near where it is right now. But for all of the correct criticisms of this clip, I think it's worth pointing out that there is additional context for this, right? Whilst I think that there are loads of things she's saying here that are wrong, it's not. I don't think there are lots of people online who've looked at this clip and said she's just doing dog whistle racism here. But if you view the remainder of the clip, It turns out that that's not actually the case of what she's saying here. And it's a clip out of a longer speech that she's been giving, which is about changing minds for people and making people be pro-immigration. For some reason, I can't find the clip, which was supposed to be in the replies somewhere. So I'm going to have to edit this out. There we go. Ash is trying to frame this talk by Margaret Hodge as being anti-immigration and racist. Here's how she concluded her talk with a call for culture to promote and accept immigration. So let's have a listen to the closure of the specific talk.
Why can't we talk up the benefits of immigration? We never do that. The benefits to the economy, the benefits to the culture, the benefits to our public services. That strong leadership, I think, could change the whole centre of gravity of the debate around migration. I always look back at 97, when, if you remember, Mrs. Thatcher had said there's no such thing as society. I thought when Labour came in, we'd find it very difficult to reassert the importance of community and giving according to your means into the common pot for the common good. We actually managed that really easily. And I think if we gave that same leadership, talking the reality, the honesty about migration and talking about the benefits of migration, I think you could change the culture and the environment and the perceptions in our community. Why can't we talk?
And I think that's true. I think that's true. Again, though, what you really have to do is you can't just talk about, well, isn't it great how the economy grows? Isn't it great how we have all of this culture in the face of people who've had their consent manufactured to think that neither of these things are true? What you have to do is you have to debunk the propaganda that they've been sold as the justifications for getting away with, either dog whistle racism or just poorly thought out anti-immigrant policy. Again, I will say this like I have millions of times on this channel, is that immigration spiked with EU membership. Immigration spiked under the Blair administration and continued throughout the David Cameron administration, whilst supply-side labour market reforms were deliberately pushing wages down. And so people wrongly attributed the wage compression to the increase in immigration, and not into the deliberate moves by neoliberal governments to want to shift money away from the working class and into the hands of millionaires and billionaires and the bourgeois classes, right? I think that, that Hodge here is incredibly naive in the ways in which she's thinking that she can just talk about how good immigration is and that will somehow change the message on this stuff. It really won't. You have to it has to be community-led, really and truly, on the ground with people of people of colour, of immigrant background, to try and further these positive representation, whilst also actually properly debunking the lies around immigration that's coming from the right and it's coming from the right-wing press, because that's where the consent gets manufactured from. But I want to go back. Initially to a point that Ash Sarkar made in the replies, because I think what really and truly defines this statement as being something that I take huge amounts of issue with. The thing I take issue here is that her characterization of this kind of anti-immigration sentiment as being a problem for working class people only, right? And that it's the real divide here is between middle class people who are fine with immigration and working class people who are having their communities full of faces that you disagree with, which is obviously fundamentally a classist assumption. It's fundamentally a classist assumption because there are loads of fucking racist middle class people, right? The kind of people that I was discussing, the people who live in East Anglia, who live in incredibly white communities, who fear becoming the kind of communities that you get in London, Manchester, Leeds, Liverpool, these very working class areas within, just outside city areas, which again, they may not be like kind of the satellite town era working class that you might believe. But of course, as I've talked about on my stream already as well, that what we think about working class has really changed. And the people who live in old industrial towns are now the people who have homes they've bought with right to buy, have much better pensions than young people who live in cities. But that's a conversation for another time. Please go back and watch my other videos about that. But really and truly, right, working class communities in these urban areas, which is the majority of where working class people still live in this country, are diverse. They are full of people who are not bigoted, who do not have that much of a care around high immigration as before. And Ash is right that it is racist ventriloquism and classism at its core, trying to assume that this caricature that they have of what a working class person should look like is this kind of the de facto working class stereotype everyone should look to. Remember when I did the piece about Lee Anderson, who made the very same position, but from a pro anti-immigration perspective, right? Specifically saying, well, actually, no, if you hate working class people, if you don't want to drop immigration because these are these views that people have, it's exactly the same thing. It's exactly the same thing, but from the other side. It's classism. It's Margaret Hodge is saying, middle class people don't get the working class people are anti-immigration and have this xenophobia, and therefore middle class people need to work to try and make working class people not be like that anymore and understand their concerns. And it's Lee Anderson who's saying, well, actually, working class people do all agree with me on my xenophobic nonsense. That's a fundamental part of being the working class, which Margaret Hodge agrees with me on. But I think that we should stop immigration anyway, and there's no benefits at all. And I agree with this caricature of working class people I have in my head. Now, I quote tweeted this one specifically, calling out Margaret Hodge's classism, with a really good clip of Akala discussing this on this free speech panel he did with Tommy Robinson about a decade ago, which still rings true to this day, about the classist way that we view racism in this country. And it's really worth a watch.
Exactly. This is exactly what I said at the beginning of the programme. When we deal with racism, rather than dealing with the structural reality and all this nonsense about people are racist because they're frustrated about their life, it's totally classist. What we're saying, only working class people are racist. Do me a favour. Racism was not invented by working class people. It was invented by elite academics through pseudoscientific nonsense and perpetuated as part of political policy. From the top down, not the bottom up. In fact, if we look back at the history of this country, when there were slave catchers in the streets, people had far more allies in working class parts of London than they did from rich people who were trying to catch them and send them back to the Caribbean. So let's be honest about the history and deal with the bigger problems of structural racism, because then smaller things and smaller frustrations that are breeding this type of nonsense won't be excavated so much. But this is the problem, is we focus on nonsense like this rather than dealing with why a British soldier you've probably never heard of, a gentleman called Christopher Alder, died in 1999 in police custody. There is footage on YouTube that you can see for yourself of him on the floor with his bottom half exposed, with police officers around him making monkey noises over his dead body. You've never heard his name. Why?
And that's exactly right. And Akala is as eloquent and as correct as always. And again, because the thing is that people, the idealized picture people have of the working class in their heads within the political and media sphere is nothing like the way it exists today, because it's a stereotype, right? It's the turning point Greg's meme. I say it all the time on stream, but I need to impress upon people that, the fact that under the kind of political and media eye, the kind of the idealized working class person is someone who lives in an ex-mining constituency in the north, who owns their own house and has a defined benefit pension, rather than somebody who lives in central London, who rents and who works full time and has a defined contribution scheme, for example. There's a huge wealth disparity between these two people, but because we idealize certain kind of vibes and tropes around what class is, rather than some kind of material analysis of people's relationship to production and their relationship to wealth, this doesn't map onto reality. It really doesn't. It also, what all of this stuff comes back to as well, is that whenever we really and truly discuss class in this country, right? Whenever we discuss class in this country, we never discuss the people of colour from these constituencies and from these demographics either, right? It's the white working class, that people who get, who are the specific kind of conjured minority group, that we always have to discuss. Well, what about the white working class, this, etc., for example? Because working class, it covers all of people who sell their labour for a wage and do not make it from investment and from ownership of production. And, that is people of all different backgrounds, all different skin tones, all different ethnicities, all different countries of origin. And the idea that it's just specifically British people who are white, who really matter in this discussion, is something that we need to properly discuss and properly tackle. And that's it again, because really and truly, the embattled proletariat of this country are people, people in their 30s, people in their 20s, who have no wealth, they have no future, they have very little money at all, But because they're socially progressive, they get treated as being middle class, right? Because in the classist eye of the media political sphere, working class equals racist. Working class equals, older white man, for example, which is of course a classist trope. Absolute complete classist trope. And Carla was right. This all comes down from the powerful, from the top down. It's perpetuated through the media. It's perpetuated through the kind of pseudoscientific stuff that was the basis for a lot of scientific racism in when these things were happening during the first kind of a backlash and the first kind of migration as a result of colonialism too. Because obviously colonialism was justified using that same scientific racism. So... again, do I think Margaret Hodge is a racist? I think absolutely not. I think that all the people on Twitter who are trying to castigate her as some massive racist for the things that she said is not getting the full picture. But do I think that she's being classist in those statements that she's made? Absolutely, right? I don't want to essentialize somebody under some kind of ism. But do I think that she has expressed classism by having this anachronistic view of what constitutes working class in this country? 100%, absolutely, because that's just absolutely is the case. If you enjoyed this video, please do consider liking and subscribing. It does help out the channel and the algorithm. And if you click the bell notification icon, it will let you know when I go live and when I upload videos. If you'd like to follow me on social media, my handle is @NoJusticeMTG, and that is Twitter, TikTok, Facebook, Instagram, Twitch, and YouTube. If you want to support my channel in a more financial manner, you can do so by becoming a member for just 99p, by super chatting, or by supporting me on Patreon, with the link is in the description of this video, and hopefully I'll catch you on the next segment.